It's been billed as a turning point for the planet. Joe Biden off to Cornwall for a G7 summit where the world's most industrialized nations, for the first time, will agree on a global corporate tax rate. Quite a coup. Ever since the time of the Pharaohs, governments raising revenue has always been exclusively a matter of national sovereignty. But as we all know, times have changed. The advent of the digital age accelerating a globalization that puts vast swathes of our activity in the cloud, far from any tax collector. And while an increasingly angry middle class continues to cough up based on what it earns from the sweat of its brow, tax avoidance by big business and the super rich, most of it perfectly legal, is increasingly stoking that anger. So, is 15% on multinational profits enough? Will other major powers agree? And just as the 2008 financial crisis begat Brexit and rising populism the world over, what will our post-pandemic world look like if leaders fail to address the antiquated rules of the taxation game? Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking how do you install tax justice? With us from Dublin, member of the Irish Parliament, Neil Richmond of the centre-right Fianna Gael party. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Delighted to be here.
Quentin Parinello, Senior Policy Advisor on Tax Justice at the charity Oxfam. Welcome back.
Thanks for having us.
Craig Kopidis, contributing editor to Quartz. How are things?
Okay, Francois.
And from Versailles, in the suburbs of Paris, economist Nathalie Janson, Associate Professor at the Neoma Business School. Welcome to the show.
Hi.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Before we rewrite the planet's playbook on taxation, let's first talk about plutocrats, the investigative reporters at ProPublica, getting hold of leaks that reveal just how little the richest Americans pay. Yuka Royer has that story.
The stark revelation confirms what has widely been believed, that America's uber-rich pay next to no federal income taxes. Amazon's boss, Jeff Bezos, paid no tax in 2007 and 2011, while Tesla's Elon Musk paid nothing in 2018, according to leaked tax data published by ProPublica.
Taken together, it demolishes the cornerstone myth of the American tax system that everyone pays their fair share and the richest Americans pay the most. The IRS records show that the wealthiest can, perfectly legally, pay income taxes that are only a tiny fraction of the hundreds of millions, if not billions, their fortunes grow each year.
That's because their wealth derives not from salaries, but from the skyrocketing value of their assets like stock and property, which are not subject to tax until they're sold. Meanwhile, like everyone else, the wealthy can get tax deductions for things like charitable donations. According to the non-profit analysis, the total wealth of 25 richest Americans jumped more than $400 billion between 2014 and 2018, while they paid less than $14 billion in taxes during the same period. The White House said disclosure of secret data was illegal and declined to comment on the findings.
I can tell you that broadly speaking, we know that there is more to be done to ensure that corporations, individuals who are at the highest income are paying more of their fair share.
President Joe Biden has pledged to reform the U.S. tax system as he seeks to finance his spending plans and address inequality in the country. His proposal includes doubling the tax on high earners' income from investments, called capital gains.
Craig Kopidis, the Biden administration also responding to this by opening a probe into who leaked those tax records. Your thoughts on that?
Well, you're not supposed to leak tax records. It's a crime in the United States, a felony. It's not supposed to be done. And it begs the question, how come they didn't leak Donald Trump's tax records, which everyone really wants?
Okay, so what we see in that ProPublica article, it's, I guess you could put it under the label shocking but not surprising.
No, look, it's not surprising. It's not surprising at all. The United States tax code is 73,954 pages long, and it's designed to be taken advantage of. When the tax code was first started, like for personal income tax in the U.S., in 1862, it was 53 pages.
Wow. Neil Richmond, I won't ask you how long the tax code is in Ireland, but your reaction to that story.
Yeah, needless to say, our tax code is a lot simpler in Ireland, as it would be in a lot of Western European countries compared to the US, when so much focus is put on the individual. But I do share the concern about any data being leaked from a government source. Indeed, it's been a big issue in Ireland in terms of hacking of personal data in the last couple of weeks. But as was rightly said, the issue and the theme of the story is not a massive surprise. And so many people have glibly, but sadly, always referred to the biggest millionaires in the world always have the best accountants who can take advantage of the system. And that falls on government officials like myself and regulators to ensure that the system is robust and isn't open for abuse. And if the findings of this story is true, and I know it's been contested by the likes of Warren Buffett already today, there's a lot of questions to be answered of what is a very complex thing. I think we should avoid trying to be too simplistic.
ProPublica's story includes two graphs that are put side by side in the article. First, you have how much Amazon owner Jeff Bezos is worth versus how much tax he paid. We can look at the graph right there. You can see it. It's that little flat yellow line at the bottom of the graph there. That's the first graph. Now, over the same period of time, the same numbers for a typical U.S. household. Remember, there was 2008. That's why it dips to below to below the zero mark there, and you see the difference. So, Quentin Parinello, what do you do? How do you address this issue?
Well, I mean, the ProPublica story is shocking, and it shows how little the richest in our society are paying in taxes, and you need a deep overhaul of the tax system, not only just taxing the richest, but also reforming the tax system as a whole to make sure that middle classes and people that are struggling to make ends meet are able.
Is it mission impossible? I mean, Jeff Bezos can hire an army of tax lawyers, right? Who can find the loopholes.
It's all about political will as well, and we've seen Joe Biden diverse announcement in terms of policy reforms, taxing capital gains. That's a first step. A wealth tax could be another step, and Senator Warren is very much in favor of it, and that could be another step in making sure that the richest in our society are paying their fair share.
Now, Teddy Jolso, this has been going on for decades, not years, decades, that we've had pledges from politicians saying that they're going to close loopholes. Here in France, same thing. Are we at a watershed moment, though?
Yes, it's a classical when it comes to taxation, and to be honest, it's quite a populist. It's easy to point out the richest saying that they're not paying tax because they are taking advantage of the tax code. In reality, you can look at it also as a substitution instead of having the government taxes, collecting the taxes and allocating the resources. Thanks to the tax code, they are pointing out to the richest where to invest their funds in reality. So if you take cases like you have tax deduction, if you found, for example, non-profit organization, like it is very often the case in the US, it's a way to channel the funds of the richest. So it's not that they don't contribute to the community, but it's just another way and a more complex way to do it. So I would say you have to choose between a very simple tax system where that so often is defended that that this is the flat tax rate. Sorry. Or if you go for a more progressive taxation system, obviously you create loopholes and you start with all the different ways and hiring lawyers to make sure that you will pay the lowest rate. But in reality, you still contribute to the community. This is what you need also to understand.
So the difference in cultures, Quentin Parinello, if you have a Michael Bloomberg who is a big philanthropist when it comes to climate change, issues like gun control. Is that okay then if he pays less tax?
I think it's a weird argument to say that we shouldn't raise taxes on the richest because they will hire an army of lawyers to avoid taxes.
They're going to hire more than an army of lawyers. The thing with Bloomberg and a lot of these guys is they believe that they can take care of their own like mini social governments with Bloomberg, certainly Bezos and all these people. But let's go to this one point here, because there's a critical point here that all of the other guests brought up. Take Bezos. Let's say the EU wants to go after Bezos, okay?
The head of Amazon.
The head of Amazon. Right now, the EU legal service, which is the legal arm of the EU, has 39 attorneys. Only 2 of them, one acting, are in charge of tax-related litigation. Their average salary, the most they can make, is 8,700 euros a month. Amazon has more than 800 lawyers in 15 countries around the world and an unlimited budget for outside counsel that has more power than the fuel that's going to launch Bezos's keister into outer space in a couple of weeks. There is no way the EU or any country, sadly, can compete against the legal firepower of these people.
Neil Richmond, do you agree it's mission impossible?
Well, I think it's a balance of things, because the abilities that government and regulators have is not necessarily the legal aspect in terms of challenging the existing laws. It's simplifying and changing the law. And that is the huge ability that's in the gift. But bearing in mind, taxation is largely a member state competence within the European Union. That's where that lies. But I don't want to get into individual people or individual companies, but you have to look at each option that each jurisdiction has and use that if you want to look for more tax justice and a more equitable system. But it's also very important to note that the tax code is so different in the United States than the European Union, and then again in member states, that it's not always comparing like for like.
Just philosophically, that's also very interesting to see that whenever there are wealth taxes in place in certain countries, such as France, for instance, we used to have a wealth tax. You also have tax cuts to actually...
Which they're talking about bringing in the US right now.
Yeah, absolutely. You're basically incentivizing people with tax cuts to say, okay, invest in the real economy. So the question is, do you actually tax people and say, well, if you do invest in the real economy, you're not paying the tax, or do you just trust them to invest in the real economy? So that's also the philosophical question behind wealth tax.
Nathalie Janson, what was your reaction when you saw this week that Janet Yellen, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, talked about instituting, let's call it a French-style wealth tax?
I think she doesn't really borrow what did the best in France. So because it doesn't really work. I mean, the wealth tax, sometimes it's even more it's more expensive to really get it done that it returns in terms of tax revenue. So honestly, it's not the best way to make sure that the money is channeled in the economy. Again, I really insist on that. When you have a tax code that is very complicated and you have many loopholes, you are just channeling the funds from the richest to certain activities that you name as the government tax deduction. So this is the way. This is where you want that money to go, and if you didn't have that tax deduction, it means that you would tax the people and you will use those funds to get it done yourself. So it's not like they don't pay. It's misleading to say that they don't pay tax. They are forced to channel their funds to certain use. So maybe it's a good thing or it's a bad thing. Then it's up to what you want in terms of what you want to achieve for your tax system. So if you want to say that you have a progressive tax system, this is what you end up with. Otherwise, as I said, you go for a very simplified tax system where you rather like emphasizing on the flat tax rate that is rather low, and so have a low incentive to get around it.
The proverbial bottom line here is the taxpayer, the voter, is responsible for all of these loopholes. Every voter, because they're the ones who elect the politicians who legislate tax code regardless of the country. Now, Neil was saying he didn't want to talk about individual people, and of course, legal systems are different in all countries. Well, this is about individual people, individual plutocrats. You have to talk about them in their companies. Number two, the point about the legal system is if the EU or any government brought a litigation, tax litigation, as they have, Vestager has done this, against Bezos, Amazon, or any of the other companies, that in a democratic society can go to court. And Amazon and Bezos's lawyers can keep them in court, as they have, for years because it's more cost effective for them. So there's going to be a delay, a delay, and a delay. If you want the tax laws to change, you've got to elect politicians who will go in, and in the UK, 17,000-page tax code, in the US, 73,954 pages, and cut out all the loopholes and hope the next crop of lawyers, tax lawyers, don't come in and create new loopholes to make sure that they don't lose the old loopholes. So that's the reality.
Neil Richmond, is there a political will today that even perhaps didn't exist in 2008 after the financial crisis?
I think there's definitely a political awareness of these sort of issues and how impactful they are on society. But we kind of go back again to a slightly more philosophical point. You know, what do we use taxation for? Be that individual income tax, be it corporation tax or anything else. Do we use it to make society more equitable, or do we use the fruits of the economy to try and make it a socially better place, to reinvest in people, individuals, to reinvest in the next entrepreneurs and the next facilities? So it's all, when you take the balanced approach, and people say we could simplify this, cut out all the loopholes and drive everything down. But if the aim is, well, how do we get as much money into government coffers and therefore into paying for resources and opportunities for the individual citizens that people like me represent in Parliament, that's where we have to look at making sure we avoid unintended consequences and we take it in the round. You know, we have to get back to, why do we tax? Why have we historically taxed? And what do we want to use tax? And how do we justify to the electorate the taxes we put in? And how do we show and demonstrate that everyone is paying their perceived fair share?
And just before we go to the break, Quentin Barinello, your reaction, you heard Nathalie Janson saying effectively that perhaps a flat tax is more effective if we're talking about fairness.
So again, it all boils down to, philosophically, do you trust the richest in our society to invest in the right places, or do you want, incentivize them to invest in the right places? And we've seen so far over the last decade that whenever we decrease taxes on the richest in society, it tends to actually concentrate wealth in the hands of a few people rather than reinvest in society and push for a fairer society.
Shocking. Gambling in Casablanca.
When we come back, we're going to take a look. We've been talking about how this is, of course, individuals. How do you tax them? When we come back, we're going to look at what's going to be at the heart of the matter at that G7 summit, a global corporate minimum tax rate. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We're asking, how do you make them pay? They being rich individuals and big corporations. Big corporations who, by the way, often pay less tax than small and medium-sized businesses proportionally. With us from Dublin, member of the Irish Parliament, Neil Richmond of the centre-right Fianna Gael party. Welcome back as well to Quentin Barinello, senior policy advisor on tax justice at the charity Oxfam. Craig Capitas, contributing editor at Quartz. And from Versailles, economist Nathalie Janson, associate professor at the Neoma Business School. Now, the white smoke came from London last Saturday after years of on and off haggling, a breakthrough on a global tax for major corporations.
Well, I'm delighted to announce that today, after years of discussion, G7 finance ministers have reached a historic agreement to reform the global tax system, to make it fit for the global digital age, but crucially to make sure that it's fair, so that the right companies pay the right tax in the right places.
15% tax on corporations above 10% of their profits. However, weekend euphoria was followed by some Monday morning blues. When the devil's in the detail, you look and you see, turns out that under what those G7 finance ministers sold, Facebook would have paid those tax at 15% rate, but not Amazon. The mega profits from its AWS cloud computing service are offset by Jeff Bezos' policy of low prices and low margins on its showcase e-commerce portal. That means they don't pay tax and get to squeeze the competition. The Bloomberg news agency now reports that Amazon may still be covered by the new rules. That could include setting a threshold for individual operations that targets Amazon more profitable cloud computing or advertising businesses rather than the whole company, whose margins are weighed down by those heavy investments and thin retail profits. So, Quentin Parinello, it's still a work in progress, this 15% global tax that's been announced by the G7?
I think we need to clarify some of the points because there are two agreements within the G7.
Okay, tell me how much I got wrong here.
So there's one agreement on the minimum floor for all multinationals to pay at least 15% effective tax rate.
Right.
That's one, right? And there's another agreement for high profit margin companies, let's say the top 100, to actually pay some taxes in the countries where they operate. So this is targeting the likes of Amazon, Google, and Facebook. And perhaps the G7 finance ministers were a bit quick to announce that they actually managed to find a deal on taxing the digital giants because, as a matter of fact, what was agreed last Saturday doesn't include Amazon on that specific pillar, right? The OECD is still working on it, but Amazon will be subject to the minimum effective tax rate of 15%. And on that matter, yes, a minimum effective tax rate for multinational is an effective way to tackle tax avoidance by big multinationals and to tackle tax haven. But for it to work very well, we need the rate to be high enough. And we estimate at Oxfam that 15% is not high enough. And we need to make sure there's not a lot of exemptions. And if we follow the news over the past 3 days, you've seen that a number of countries, including France, for instance, are now asking for exemptions to the 15% effective tax rate.
Already, what are the exemptions in France?
So France is asking for the research tax credit, Crédit Impôt Recherche, to be exempted. Yeah. China, for instance, wants logistical warehouses to be exempted. On the other side of the negotiation, the UK wants the financial services and the city companies in the city to be exempted. So now that we have a global deal, everyone is asking for exemptions, and this is where we need to be very careful that the ambition is not lowered. We actually need the ambition to be increased to make sure that the deal is fair.
Nathalie Janson, you agree?
Unfortunately, I'm not surprised. So first of all, the average tax rate of the for companies is at the international level. It's more or less 24%, I believe. So you can see that the 15%, yes, sure, is an achievement, but not that huge, considering that on average it's 24%. So you can see here that the negotiation was really on clearly having all countries on board as much as they could, because if they had started, because we're talking about 20% for a long time before cutting down to 15, and you can see that the 20% was too much, at least for certain countries. So you can see here clearly a bargaining of countries to make sure that they would all sign. So it's clearly a negotiation. And as Quentin said, indeed, the problem again is that in each country, our tax rate on companies is always, it goes with exception, with loopholes. And you can see here again that since each country have their favorite sector, they want a unique tax rate at the international level until they want to try to deal an exception for themselves. So you see that we are very far from having a real agreement here.
So hold on, Craig Capitas. We're hearing that there are those pushing already for loopholes.
Right.
You heard Quentin argue that he thinks 15% is not enough. It's still a race to the bottom compared to the level that are currently pointed out by Nathalie. Is this a watershed moment or is this a nothing burger?
Never eat at a place called Mom's. Never play cards with a man called Doc. And the moment you hear a politician talking about tax begin a sentence by saying, I'm delighted to announce you better count your pennies and pounds in your pocket. The last few minutes of discussion, I didn't understand a word of what any of you were talking about. Not a word. The question is, how are you going to enforce it? How are you going to actually make it happen physically within a time frame which we don't know? And how are you going to attend to the court challenges we talked about in the first half of the program? These are legitimate questions.
Yeah, the beauty of that measure is that it's designed to be also applied unilaterally. So if there's one country or a bunch of countries that are opposed to it, one country can go unilaterally. And the US has already said that should the negotiation stall, so too much, they will do that unilaterally. And that would work as one country that, let's say one country refuses to increase its tax rate to the minimum effective level.
Are they going to do that? Is the United States going to do that in the tax havens of Delaware and Nevada?
Okay, so domestically,
I'd like to know that, because our Irish friend there, Neil, he's getting socked in this. They did a pretty good deal up there in Ireland for corporations. The Irish economy looks to be doing real good. They're honest folks up there, as I understand it.
But they're draining resources from other member states.
Well, let's bring in Neil Richmond. Neil, you heard about what the average is on global tax. We know that in Ireland it's 12.5% currently. It's below 15%. 12.5, 15, it's kind of the same, right? You guys are okay with going up to 15%.
It's not necessarily kind of the same. I have to take issue with the really lazy comment to say that Ireland is draining resources from member states. Ireland is a net contributor to the European Union. Ireland has a fair taxation system. And whenever we talk about this in the context of European tax harmonisation, Ireland's always been painted as the bad guy, and absolutely scurrilous remarks are talked about, are used, but no one ever looks at the internals of the big member states. And what we have at the weekend is a partial agreement across two pillars between the G7. So the 7 big economies. There's 139 countries as part of this discussion. And trying to compare the Irish economy, which is a small economy with a population of less than 5 million people. We're part of the European Union, a lot smaller than France, a lot smaller than Germany, the UK, Japan, everyone else. We have to be able to use tax as part of our dynamic, attractive policies, because we don't have the economies of scale, we don't have the geography, and we don't have the resources that other member states do. And we also don't have the ability to make sweeping declarations at international summits.
Yeah, but hang on, a 2.5% difference. What would be the impact on Ireland if you went from 12.5 to 15%?
Yeah, in monetary terms, it'd be about €800 billion. It is substantial. We are a very favoured destination for a lot of multinational companies, nothing to do with our tax rate. The fact that we're the only English-speaking common law jurisdiction in the EU with one of the highest third-level education is certainly part of it. Is Microsoft are in my own constituency. They're employing 72 different nationalities, 2,500 people. Those individuals and that company has been there for over 30 years for many reasons. But any change, we accept that change is coming in terms of corporate tax. We accept that, and we're preparing for change. But we think anyone saying that, well, this has been decided, or that this is something that everyone else just has to get on board, has to be a bit clear. Ireland has played a very productive part of this process since 2013. We have gone through the ringer. Bear in mind, we came out of the financial crisis after shouldering a lot of the responsibility for the entire European Union, not just our own economy. And we've come back with every review with flying colours. And that's why we approach this session. Our own finance minister was at the G7 meeting at the weekend in his role as president of the Eurogroup. We'll approach it proactively, productively, but we have to be aware that there's a long way to go in this. And yeah, we want to make sure companies pay their fair price, but we also just don't want the world to become so imbalanced that it's solely about the largest economies.
Quentin Parinello?
Yeah, just a couple of things. First of all, we're talking about effective tax rate. So Ireland has a 12.5 nominal tax rates, but it's actually offering lower effective tax rates to a number of multinationals. We've seen recent report of Microsoft not paying a single euro on corporate income tax in Ireland last year, I think.
That's correct.
But to be fair, that report is disputed, and we see a lot of those are attractive tax rates for initial investment or initial relocation, something that's very common, particularly in France, and we see it down to individual department levels. What we see the effective tax rate, and it's constantly put out by the OECD, that Ireland does meet its responsibilities, and we enforce our 12.5% assiduously, and we continue to play our fair share and our part within both the European Union and the wider global economic community.
But Neil, do you take the point that some people are miffed when they see these big corporations doing business elsewhere in the European Union? The transactions are happening elsewhere in the European Union, but the tax is being paid in Ireland. What isn't that the root of the problem? That globalization really changes the way we should look at tax.
And indeed, Ireland, through this process, has been quite clear that we support the idea of market jurisdiction and making sure that particularly digital companies do pay into their markets. We are concerned about the American suggestion because it has been outlined by all the other speakers. It allows for loopholes and allows for certain companies to avoid them. But we're contributing to that. We understand the need for that, and we support the need for that as well.
Yes, I think it all boils down again to a philosophical, vision of what we think. What is competition? When we base our competition on tax policies, it's a situation where everyone loses because states are denied revenues. They can't invest enough in hospitals, in schools, in infrastructure, and even for companies, this is bad. That speech is not only Oxfam; it's also Janet Yellen's speech saying that we need a win-win competition where we compete on infrastructure, where we compete on the skills of our workers, and this is a positive competition. And just to say one thing, because as I said before, there are two pillars in the negotiation, right? One on the minimum tax that could yield, tens of billions of dollars in revenues. The other one on, making sure that high profit margin companies are paying taxes. This one could yield 1 to 5 billion, euros in revenues. So that's much smaller. So we need to make sure that the minimum effective tax rate is ambitious enough.
So Nathalie Janson, is this going to happen?
I don't know if it's going to really happen. I know that what they want to, in order to enforce it, what they are planning to do is that the country will still have the same corporate tax, but the difference will be paid with the home country of the company. So in other words, if you have a 12.5, an Irish companies, they still pay 12.5, but if they do business in France, they would pay the 2.5 difference to France.
Let me bring in Neil Richmond on this. Is that fair enough?
Well, I think
Neil Richmond.
Yeah, no, and I think people have talked about equality, but is this the big member states, the big economies ganging up on the small economies? People are talking about revenue being lost and people paying their fair share. But as I said, Ireland has a population of less than 5 million euro. We do not have the economy of scale. And is it just moving all the resources into the G7, the largest economies in the world? Where is the global justice in that? Where is the opportunity for dynamic economies?
Excuse me for asking, aren't these crocodile tears? After all, Ireland has highly skilled workforce. You speak English. Microsoft's not going to leave, are they?
If they get a better deal elsewhere, yeah, they will. It's called the free market.
Part of the overall package. As I stated, Ireland is a very attractive investment destination for a lot of reasons, but we do, and it's not just Ireland. Bear in mind, Ireland doesn't have the lowest corporation tax in the EU, and indeed 16 member states within the EU, just talking about the EU, have lower tax rates than the average. It's all about economies and scale, and it's all about the big member states saying, no, you need to pay your fair share, you need to pay more, without reflecting the differences in economies and differences in scale. I think it's a little bit much. If we want to look for agreement on this, and we want to look for a realization, well, then we have to make sure that those big economies also fully implement this throughout theirs, and they realize that there's a big difference on what is on offer. And it is right for smaller countries around the world to be able to use taxation to attract investment and to ensure that our citizens have the same opportunities as the citizens from France and the US or the UK.
Neil's right. Neil is right. Because if the US, for instance, was going to do this, shut down the tax havens of Nevada and Delaware, they won't do that because they're generating capital. The hardball decision made with the lawyers in the boardrooms is, you want to be competitive, France? You want to get that Irish money? Make your tax rates more advantageous. Everything orbits around two things in business: tax rates and interest rates. That's how the decisions are made.
Just to answer on this, because we're already on a trend, where every country, when France, cuts its tax rate, then Germany does, then the UK does, then Italy does, then Spain does, then the US does, and so on and so on. And if we keep on that trend, multinational corporations will end up with paying 0% tax rate by 2050, and this isn't acceptable. But just to come back on Neil's point, saying this is this is not a G7 decision, and he's absolutely right. There are almost 140 countries negotiating that deal, including a large number of developing countries that have
just to remind our viewers once again that you have what you described, which is there's the G7 with this proposal, and then behind it there's going to be G20 and the OECD, which is this talk shop here in Paris where all the countries are trying to come to a
there are
common
139 countries negotiating right now, including a lot of developing countries. A lot of developing countries are not specifically happy with the G7 deal because the G7 countries would, attract 60% of the revenues of the minimum tax. So they're saying, let's, split up the cake more equally. And they did a lot of proposals about this. And I've never seen Ireland over the past 4 years support the proposal of developing countries saying, let's split up the cake more equally with developing countries. So I hear that, there's something between rich countries and the others. But then, let's support what developing countries are saying. Let's actually divide the cake more equally with also developing countries.
May I ask a question? How quickly do you think this would need to be enacted and put into operation?
Ideally.
Ideally, to prevent what you said just a few moments ago, that corporations are going to end up controlling everything. What's the speed?
As soon as possible. And again,
what is as soon as possible? We know, like with climate change, there's a certain time frame.
So the calculation, they were done by an NGO called Eurodad. They said that if we keep on this trend of decreasing corporate income taxes, by 2052, corporate income taxes could hit zero.
2052.
That's tomorrow, right?
That is.
So that's tomorrow. Again, we can implement these measures unilaterally. It's better if we do it collectively, but we can do it unilaterally. And if one country is blocking, there's nothing preventing the other from moving on unilaterally.
Nathalie Janson, you're an economist, but again, it's about politics. We saw the pressure from several quarters after the 2008 financial crisis. The response was considered tepid by many. We had Occupy Wall Street. We have had in France the Yellow Vests movement since. We have seen how if these imbalances are not addressed head on, there's going to be political turmoil. Again, I ask the question, will there be change?
Yes, it's a lot of politics because anyway, I wish we could experience having countries keep lowering down their tax rate to see that maybe it works even better without such a high tax rate, and that everyone would be happier.
How does it work better in France, where we've had big protests over the fact that you've had over decades now a disengagement of the state in essential public services, including those that impact those essential care workers, the health sector, the education sector? How does it help collecting less tax?
I think that there is what is a kind of very surprising is that France is the country that helped the most low-income family, and so there is the country with the lowest inequalities. But still, you have a perception that the government doesn't do the job. So
it's not a perception; it's fact. I mean, they're disengaging more and more. There's less and less money spent on public services.
Yes, but it doesn't mean it's not because you spend less that you spend less efficiently. Okay, it's also this that you need to take into consideration. And if the final aim is to make the society more equal, this is what we get to in France. You have seen the last articles that have been released during the crisis. We are the country that have protected the most the low-income families. So from that point of view, I think it's still a French paradox It's not because you have a big state that you spent wisely. Usually when you have a big state, you tend to be not that efficient. So it's not because you spend less that you are really downgrading the quality of the public services. Okay, so it's two separate issues, and I think that it's just that agreement on the global tax rate. I'm quite sympathize on the fact that indeed there is a problem, because the problem is related to the fact that when you are multinational, you can do much more things than when you are national companies. So and this is, from my viewpoint, the main issue. It's indeed when you are a local company, you cannot do what the multinational can do and try to use all the tax competition around the world, because you are just stick at home and you have to pay tax rate at home.
How to level the playing field for those small and medium-sized businesses that are an easier target for the taxman. That's definitely the subject for a further conversation. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I want to thank Neil Richmond for joining us from Dublin, Nathalie Janson in Versailles, Craig Capitas, Quentin Parinello. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.